You know the old saying that says that everything you like to do is either illegal, immoral, or fattening. Well, that's never been true than in the 1980s, where we are confronted with a situation that absolutely oppresses us with rules and regulations, or wows us saying you can't do this and you can't do that. It's a pity because it tends to destroy the fantasies that we all live with from time to time, and particularly those that apply to things like Learjets and private round-the-world trips and arriving at your destination and leaving the Learjet for something equally luxurious like a 924 Turbo Porsche. I can't see that there's any way in the world that I would be ever likely to have enough money to own a Learjet, but I guess it would be possible, if I really worked at it, for me to buy something like the 924 Turbo Porsche. The question then is, could I justify the expense? And I suppose in some ways I could, but in other ways I'd have some difficulty. I suppose my principal concern in the 1980s would be whether or not spending that sort of money on any car could be justifiable in terms of the combination of performance and economy that I could subsequently achieve with it. Now, that in respect of the Porsche is something that we will investigate a little later on in the program. But it does bring up the point of one particular feature of the Porsche which is significant. The engine is turbocharged. Turbocharging, as I think we've mentioned before, is a method of forcing the air-fuel mixture into the engine under pressure, as a result of which we get an increase in power, performance and economy. Not a bad effort, actually. Let's consider where we'll be for the next few years. We've been bombarded lately with suggestions of changes of engine and even electric cars and all sorts of modifications, but in fact we are stuck for the time being at least with the internal combustion engine, and we've got to face that fact. What we'll get is variations on that engine. They'll be powered by petrol, by diesel fuel, by LPG, over which a question already hangs, and by gasohol, which is a blend of petrol and alcohol, and maybe even by alcohol itself, and they may or may not be turbocharged. What we've done here is to assemble 3 Volkswagen Golfs. One, diesel, pure, 1.4 litre high-speed diesel, quite efficient. The next one, turbocharged diesel. Now, there is a turbocharged diesel Golf made by Volkswagen in Germany, not yet available generally. This one is locally modified, and it's not as good as the factory option, but it's not bad. And lastly, the standard run-of-the-mill 1.6 litre petrol Golf, which we've grown to know and to love. A little later on in the program, we'll take a look at LPG and gasohol, but for the moment, just to look at these 3. And I must begin by saying they are all manual versions. The point of bringing the 3 Golfs together is to quantify the differences between the 3 current internal combustion alternatives: petrol power, diesel power and turbo diesel power. I'll specify the differences in noise levels and in performance and in economy. In that way, we'll know what's the best possible combination for now, and then we can see where LPG and gasohol might fit in the future. What a pity it is that the Volkswagen Golf was confronted with so rapid a price escalation so soon after its release onto the Australian market. It really is a very good little town carriage indeed. In fact, the petrol version is even better than a town carriage. It's good in the country too. It's a very brisk little car. In fact, it might even be slightly too brisk for some people. Being front-wheel drive, it has its idiosyncrasies of steering and handling. Sometimes in sort of tight uphill corners, there's even a fraction too much power because it tends to spin a wheel from time to time. But it's a very good concept, a well-packaged car with lots of room inside, even a reasonable amount of boot space. And I can't see any reason in the world why it wouldn't have acquired for itself a great many people who've fallen in love with it. To check performance, we've run all three Golfs from 0 to 100 kilometres per hour and taken accurate timing. For the petrol Golf, we achieved an extremely nippy average of 10.5 seconds, and our overall fuel consumption was 27 miles per gallon, or 10.5 litres per 100 kilometres. Just before we finish with the petrol car, a word or two about petrol. There is at this moment an incredible argument raging right around the country about whether or not we should be using lead in petrol. Now, in the first place, the lead is there as an extender of the fuel. It boosts the octane number without having to over-refine the product. In the second place, a very large number of people claim that lead in fuel does harm to children. As long as that argument rages, and as long as it is unresolved, then as far as I'm concerned, we must resolve it in favour of the children and take the lead out. There is no other answer. Now let's have a look at the diesel. First thing you notice about the diesel Golf that's different from the petrol is the cold start operation. In this case it's not cold, but normally once you switch the ignition on, you have to wait for just a few seconds for a little light to go off because it's a glow plug engine and it needs to have some heat before it'll start. Right, start it, and the next thing you notice is that it's noisy by comparison with the petrol engine car. And that may or may not be a problem, but we can find that out once we get it into town and around the street, so let's have a try at that. Surprisingly enough, that noise, which is so annoying while the engine is at idle, completely disappears once you get the Golf diesel moving. That's a nice surprise because I would have thought that it might sound a bit like a diesel truck all the time, and it doesn't. In fact, I've had some strange preconceived ideas about this whole unit. I've been reading so much about it, and this is the first time that I've ever driven it, that I had an idea that it wouldn't pull the skin off a rice pudding, as they say in the classics, and that it was noisy all the time, but it's neither of those things. In reality, it's very pleasant. It is a very good town car. It does suffer a bit on long, steep ascents, and you need to use the gearbox fairly freely. But apart from that, it manages to keep up with the traffic flow every bit as well as anything else you're ever likely to drive. And for that reason, would seem to be very practical, particularly in view of the fact that we know that it is a good deal more economical to use in terms of its fuel consumption. But there is no way it could ever be described as being a performance car. That it is not. Right, well, having established all that, the next thing that we need to know is just how much the deficit of performance is. So we'll stop the car and run it through from 0 to 100 kilometres per hour at maximum effort and see how it compares with the petrol Golf. Inevitably, it's a tortoise and hare result with an average of 19.5 seconds, but fuel economy of some 50 miles per gallon or 5.5 litres per 100 kilometres. .5 seconds as against 10.5 seconds is a pretty startling speed differential. But then again, so's the economy figures, somewhere about 50 miles per gallon or somewhere in the vicinity of about half that. And it's worth bearing in mind that the petrol version is a very high-spirited motor car, perhaps unnecessarily so in this day and age. Interesting thing about diesels, they are fairly free of hydrocarbon and carbon monoxide emissions, but fairly loaded up in oxides of nitrogen, which is a different sort of ball game altogether. In fact, the Americans have been so concerned about oxides of nitrogen that they've legislated a level for 1983 which diesels cannot ever hope to attain. And that's interesting because American manufacturers are continuing to build diesels anyway. Perhaps they're considering conservation as more important than emissions. Now, as it happens, to at least a certain extent, turbocharging can cure that problem. Because the air-fuel mixture is forced in under pressure, the whole overall efficiency of the engine is increased. That is because there's more mixture in there. The bigger the explosion, the better the burn, the more of the power stroke, and so on and so on and so on. This little car accelerates from 0 to 100 kilometres per hour in about 15 to 16 seconds. That is almost exactly halfway between the petrol Golf and the standard diesel Golf, and thus it is a great deal livelier than the standard diesel Golf. At the same time, it produces fuel economy figures which are closer to the standard diesel. That is somewhere about 6 litres per 100 kilometres, 45 miles per gallon or better. That's exceptionally good, particularly in view of the fact that there's been such a pickup in terms of its overall responsiveness. Just so happens it's also smoother and quieter than the standard diesel, and on a par, I would suggest, with the petrol engine car. It is distinctly possible that turbocharged diesels in cars other than Golfs would produce figures that are at least comparable and therefore appealing. So there are some fairly obvious benefits from turbocharging. In the first place, a slight reduction in the emissions. In the second place, an almost exact bisecting of the performance of the standard diesel and the standard petrol Golfs, which makes it a reasonable performer. More importantly, fuel economy figures closer to the standard diesel than to the standard Golf, which puts it up in the 50 mile per gallon bracket once again. And that's pretty important because it's going to cost you in the vicinity of $1,000 or so more to buy a turbocharged diesel than a standard diesel. Now, in a little while, we'll have a look at a petrol engine with a turbocharger with the Porsche 924. But right now, you're probably wondering where LPG fits into our alternative fuels program. So let's look at that next. The most remarkable thing about liquefied petroleum gas was the fact that suddenly in 1979 the Australian government decided to enthusiastically promote it as an alternative fuel for the masses. And yet for the past 15 years that same government have been developing, implementing and enforcing a set of Australian design rules which are supposed to cover all the safety aspects of cars in Australia. There was at the time almost no even basic guidelines for the installation of LPG, let alone a rigid design rule. Thus, there were bound to be problems with installation from the safety point of view. And for a short time, there were one or two, and we're probably lucky there were not more than that. In truth, LPG is not the answer as far as fuel is concerned for the great mass of Australian motorists. It does have application for very large fleets and taxi cab operators, however, because they at least do sufficient mileage to get back the cost of installation, which is very high. And while we're on installations, let's take a look at one that is safe. The Japanese have been using liquefied petroleum gas as a fuel extensively for about 15 years, and thus they've overcome most of the problems of safety in installations. It's time for us to take note of what they've done to do it. In the first place, the tank which actually contains the liquid fuel is stored within a steel sheath, sealed and vented to the outside of the car. Thus, should there be a leak of any kind from the tank which contains the fuel, that fuel will leak outside the car into the atmosphere and not be contained within the car in any way at all. No noxious fumes, no gas to explode. That's the most important thing. Apart from that, there are other things. There are little valves and there are little lines to carry the fuel to the engine, all of which need consideration and all of which need some kind of design rule legislation, I would think. While I've got this boot open, you might also notice that as far as liquefied petroleum gas is concerned, you lose a great deal of your boot space. That's certainly a disadvantage for the private motorist. It may well be a disadvantage for a taxi cab operator as well. It might also be as well to mention that because of the rate at which it comes out of the ground, LPG could never cater for more than about 20% of the total motoring population of Australia. And, of course, it's another finite resource. Now, some forms of alcohol fuel are not finite, they're renewable. To find out the whys and the wherefores of one great hope for the future, I asked fuels expert Dr. Dick McCann to explain firstly, what are the alcohol fuels?
There's two different types of alcohol fuels. They're called methanol and ethanol. Ethanol is the one that we all drink in wine and beer, and that can be used in cars. Methanol is similar to that, except it's a poison, and it has been made years ago from the distillation of wood. At the moment, people are looking at making methanol from coal or from natural gas, and ethanol is the one that we're interested in, and that's made from the fermentation of agricultural crops such as sugarcane or cassava or sugar beet.
Are both usable as fuels for motor vehicles?
Yes, they're both usable, and I think we'll certainly see them being used sometime in the 80s.
But to get methanol, we'd have to break down coal, which we might like to use for other purposes.
Exactly, that's the difference. Ethanol is a renewable energy source, methanol is a non-renewable energy source.
Okay. Ethanol renewable because it grows. Now, how much do we need and how do we make it and what's the process and why aren't we using it now?
Well, we get about 4,000 litres of alcohol as a general rule from a hectare of land, depending to a certain extent whether you're growing sugarcane or cassava or wheat. It can be made by the process of fermentation. It requires a lot of land, and I think for that reason we won't see ethanol making a big contribution, perhaps 10 or 20% of our liquid fuel requirements in the future. But even so, that's a very significant proportion.
When you say a lot of land, just try and define for us how much land. People can't sort of imagine what a lot of land is. It seems to me that it's a pretty big country. Is there not a lot of land available?
I think you'd need probably something like 1.5 to 2 million hectares of land to make a 20% substitution. There's a lot of land in Australia, but there's not so much arable land that would give good yields of crops, and I think that's the problem.
So we may have to sacrifice some crops in order to make ethanol fuels.
Yes, I think a lot of people have looked at the conflicting of interests of whether or not we eat our way into the future or we drive our way into the future.
If 1 hectare of cropped land will produce 4,000 litres of fuel, how far will that take the average Australian motorist?
Well, I think the average motorist probably uses about 3,000 litres of fuel in a year, so 1 hectare of land is more than enough to drive the family car for a whole year.
Tell us what modifications have to be made to cars in order to use ethanol either as a straight-run fuel or as a blend.
Well, this car we're leaning up against is one running totally off alcohol. It's actually running off 95% alcohol and 5% water. The changes that we've done here are to increase the compression ratio to about 11.6 to 1. We fitted effectively a new carburetor, which allows more fuel to enter into the block, and we've changed the calibration on the distributor and also replaced some of the plastic materials. Alcohol is a bit more corrosive to some plastics, more corrosive than petrol, so we've made the changes there. They're the basic ones. It would cost a bit to do that to existing cars, but once they were in commercial production on an assembly line, there's actually no problem in making an alcohol car.
What are the problems in operation?
Virtually none, except a bit of problem with cold starting, which would mean that you'd have to have a special vaporizer on cold mornings that you could switch this on and this would vaporize the alcohol fuel. We get about 12% more power out of this car. Consumption is higher because alcohol actually has less energy in a litre than petrol does, so you have to use a bit more to go a certain distance. But it's a joy to drive. It's a really pleasant car. And emissions, one of the important things, is there's no lead pollution. And most of the other emissions are much less than you get with a petrol car. So using alcohol cars in cities would make make them a more pleasant place to live in.
So the other alternative is to use it as a blender with petrol?
Yes, that's the option that's probably most favoured at the moment, because it enables us to use our existing car stock without any changes at all. And you can run a 15 or a 20% blend of alcohol with standard petrol without having to do any modifications except tuning. And this is an important use, I think, in the stock. The reason you can use standard petrol is that alcohol has a higher octane rating, so there's no need to actually use a premium or a super-grade petrol in a blend of alcohol.
So obviously ethanol has potential as a motorcar fuel. Are we likely to see it in the near or distant future?
In the near future, I think you'll see, in a small way, within the next 2 years, farmers in Australia actually making their own alcohol and using it on the farm. Towards the latter half of this decade, I think we'll see quite large alcohol plants springing up in North Queensland, perhaps in the wheat belts of New South Wales, and perhaps in Victoria. And eventually, I think by the 1990s, we'll be on our way to having a 10% substitution of ethanol into our petrol fuel economy.
Okay, time for some conclusions, I think. Firstly, LPG. And no, not for you, unless of course you run a high mileage fleet or a taxi cab. Secondly, alcohol. Well, yes, certainly, but not for a little while, because we haven't made enough yet. And not straight, but as a blend, at least for starters. Thirdly, diesels, and the answer definitely is yes, and more particularly if they're turbocharged. And that leads me to the part that I've been looking forward to. That little glimpse we had earlier of this car was just a teaser. Now we can really start to take a look at it. It's pretty, isn't it? But you'll notice that it's a completely different shape than the earlier 911 series Porsche. And that's because, like Volkswagen, Porsche did a complete turnaround and changed the configuration of the car from rear-engine rear-wheel drive to front-engine rear-wheel drive. Hence, new shape completely. Can't build them the same shape with a different engine configuration. It'll cost you around $40,000 to buy one of these, and for most of us, that remains, therefore, a bit of a fantasy. But a fantasy can be intriguing, even by remote control, so let's try. As a country road touring car, the Porsche is superb, and you really don't have to drive it fast to take advantage of it. It's just as good at 100 to 110 kilometres per hour as it is at 100 to 110 miles per hour. Comfortable, quiet, sure-footed, confidence-boosting, all of the things that you'd expect from a superb German sports coupe. And without a doubt, a better handling car than the 911 series as a result of the better balance of the front engine and not so much weight swinging around at the tail. As a city car, the 924 Turbo has some advantages and some disadvantages. And I have to say from the outset that the advantages decidedly outweigh the disadvantages. It's really quite beautiful. But let me point out a couple of small problems to begin with. In the first place, a fairly small cockpit area with a lot of glass. A car built rather more for German or European conditions than for Australian conditions with very hot sun. And despite the fact that it's air-conditioned, the air conditioning cannot adequately cope with the intense heat that builds up inside this area. That's a disadvantage, but it's not a major one. It just means that sometimes you'll be slightly uncomfortable. And the second problem is one I've been on about before and I'm about to go on about again. And I think in this case I'm really surprised to find that Porsche designers have elected to put the brake and the throttle pedal on totally different planes, so that once again you need to lift your foot a long way from the accelerator pedal to put it on the brake. And it certainly, for Porsche of all people, needs some rethought. Okay, in other areas it's superb, it really is. It has a beautiful gearbox, fantastic brakes, fairly heavy clutch but certainly not heavy enough to worry you, good accurate steering, and terrific torque. One of the advantages of turbocharging is that it does provide excellent torque characteristics, and you can drive it at less than, say, 4,000 RPM without making the turbo work hard and get completely reasonable performance from it. And then, of course, once you get to 4,000 RPM, the turbo really goes to work and you've got maximum performance, but at the expense of fuel economy. So it's worthwhile bearing in mind that if you need fuel economy or you want fuel economy, that you should drive in the low end of the power band, that is under about 4,000 RPM. Do that, and the 924 in cities is a delight. It might seem strange to have to do stress testing in a car that's built for stress, but obviously it's still important. I don't need to worry about doing a brake test because we're driving pretty hard, and I know the brakes are good just by what I'm doing with them here at Oran Park. I also have to tell you that, like all Porsches I've ever driven, there are some tiny problems at maximum effort driving. Much like the old 911s, this car has a tendency to want to transfer its weight fairly dramatically in on-off throttle situation. It's not as violent or as dramatic as it used to be in the 911 series, but nevertheless it is a bit strange, meaning that you get a fairly sudden transition of understeer to oversteer, which is a bit uncomfortable at times. By the same token, one needs to bear in mind that the cornering effort of the car is so much greater than most other cars that you would never be up at that limit unless you were competing in some form of motorsport. So if we just back off a fraction and drive a little more realistically, there's truly no problems at all. It's very good. The variation of economy in this car is really quite astonishing. If you make full use of the turbo power, you get fuel consumption figures in the vicinity of about 16 to 17 litres per 100 kilometres, which is not good. On the other hand, if you're fairly gentle with it, you can achieve figures like 11 or 12 litres per 100 kilometres in town, and even better, 9, maybe even 8 in the country. And that's not too bad at all. Is it worth $40,000? Well, frankly, no, but that's not Porsche's fault. That's the fault of the Australian government. That's the tariff system for you. In the meantime, I managed very successfully to miss out on a Learjet, but at least I got my hands on a 924 turbo. Looks like I'll have to find a turbocharged ferry.
Next week, talk moves into the later time slot of 8 o'clock, with the inventors moving forward to 7:30. The time again for next week's talk, 8 o'clock. Next on ABC, The Inventors, followed by A Family Affair.